Ancient Athens, the cradle of democracy, the birthplace of philosophy, a city of marble and mines that shaped our world. We picture the Parthenon, gleaming against a perfect blue sky. We imagine Plato and Socrates debating the nature of the soul. But in those same streets, under the shadow of the celebrated Acropolis, a session with an enslaved woman could cost less than a jug of cheap wine. This isn't a story about the great thinkers or glorious wars. This is the story of the women who paid the true price for that golden age. This is the story of the pornai, the enslaved women of Athenian brothels. Their systematic abuse was an accepted part of the economy that funded the city's splendor, and their suffering has been almost entirely erased from history. Their story must be told. To understand the darkness, you first have to see the light it was hiding in. The Athens of the 5th century BC was a marvel. Under the statesman Pericles, the city was bursting with artistic genius, architectural wonders, and a radical new idea called democracy. Men gathered in the agora to debate, to vote, and to shape their own destiny. But this grand experiment in freedom had a brutal, uncrossable line. For half its population, the women, Athens wasn't a democracy. It was a gilded cage. A citizen woman was legally under the control of a man her entire life, passed from her father to her husband. While widows or women from powerful families could sometimes exercise a degree of influence, for most, their world was the oikos, the home. Their purpose was simple: to bear legitimate male heirs to continue the family line. She was meant to be unseen and unheard, a faithful guardian of the household, while her husband was free to seek pleasure elsewhere. This rigid social structure created a void, a need the city was more than willing to fill. If a citizen wife's role was strictly for procreation, then desire had to be outsourced, and so Athens created a vast and brutally efficient industry to service that desire, an industry built on the bodies of women who had no rights, no protection, and often not even a name. Now, not all women who sold sex were seen as equal. At the very top of this grim pyramid were the hetairai. The word means female companions, and they were the closest a woman in Athens could get to social and intellectual freedom. Often foreign-born and highly educated, a hetaira was a courtesan who offered more than sex. She provided witty conversation, musical skill, and intellectual companionship at the all-male drinking parties known as symposia. The most famous of them all, Aspasia of Miletus, was the long-term partner of Pericles himself, a woman whose mind was said to be as brilliant as any man's in Athens. Hetairai could command high prices and achieve a level of influence unimaginable for a citizen wife. But the life of a hetaira was a rare exception. It was a sliver of privilege in an ocean of despair. For the vast majority of women in this world, the reality was a nightmare. They were the pornai, a word that literally comes from the Greek verb to sell. They were the lowest rung of society, women and girls who were not companions, but commodities. Most were enslaved, captured in war, abandoned as infants, or sold by destitute families. They weren't hired for their minds, they were bought for their bodies. And their price could be grotesquely low. Ancient sources mention that a visit to a brothel could cost a single obol, the same price as a loaf of bread, and yes, less than a cheap jug of wine. They were the foundation of Athens' sexual economy. The brothels of Athens weren't hidden away in shame. They were a legal, state-regulated part of the city, often found in the busy port of Piraeus or near the central marketplace, the agora. The famous lawmaker Solon was even credited with setting up the first state-owned brothels, framing it as a way to maintain public order. But inside these legal walls, the law offered no protection. For the pornai, life was a cycle of relentless exploitation. Court speeches and historical records, even if sometimes exaggerated for rhetorical effect, paint a horrifying picture. A woman might be forced to serve 6, 10, or even more men in a single day. Her owner would collect the profits while she might only get enough to buy a handful of food. Many of these victims were young. Evidence suggests some girls were forced into this life as children. To mark them as property, some owners would brand them with hot irons, a permanent scar that declared them as nothing more than livestock. There was no concept of consent. Refusing to work meant immediate and brutal punishment. Public whippings and starvation were tools of compliance. For new girls, their initiation was often a deliberate act of soul-crushing cruelty, an assault designed to break their spirit and extinguish any hope of defiance. Even the graffiti found on ancient walls hints at a darker cruelty, where some customers paid extra not for pleasure, but for the right to inflict pain. Escape was nearly impossible. Under Athenian law, an enslaved person was property. A runaway pornai wasn't a person seeking freedom, she was stolen goods. If caught, the punishment was often a terrifying public spectacle. A recaptured person could be branded on the forehead as a mark of shame and a warning to others. Even the temples offered no real sanctuary. A desperate woman seeking refuge could be dragged back to her owner. Perhaps the most chilling fact is that this entire system of human suffering wasn't just tolerated by the Athenian state, it was a source of revenue. Prostitution was taxed. Every brothel owner, pimp, and independent prostitute had to pay the pornikon telos, a tax on their earnings. This tax revenue flowed directly into the city's treasury. It contributed to the very same funds that were used to pay for public buildings, maintain roads, and supply the military that defended Athenian democracy. The glory of the Parthenon, the power of the Athenian fleet, it was all financed in part by a system of institutionalized abuse. The great men of Athens, the philosophers, playwrights, and politicians, walked through a city built on this foundation. They debated justice and virtue while profits from broken bodies helped fill the state's coffers. Aristotle himself, one of history's greatest minds, referred to an enslaved person as a living tool, a view that perfectly summed up the city's horrifying consensus. A woman's body could be cheaper than wine, but her suffering helped build an empire. The financial cost was counted in obols and drachmas, but the human cost was incalculable. Life was brutally short. Given the constant abuse, rampant disease, and malnutrition, it's hard to imagine that many pornai survived past their mid-20s. If a woman fell ill, she was often forced to work until she collapsed. Medical care was a waste of money to her owner. It was cheaper to let a woman die and simply buy a new girl. Archaeologists have unearthed skeletons from this period bearing the silent testimony of this life: severe pelvic trauma, broken bones, and spinal deformities. Pregnancy wasn't a blessing. It was damage to property. While direct Athenian evidence is scarce, forced abortions and infanticide were known practices in the ancient world. The discovery of infant remains in wells and drainage channels in Athens is a grim reminder that newborns, especially girls, were often left to die. Under Athenian law, these women were legal ghosts. Their bodies were not their own. Their testimony in court was considered worthless unless it was extracted under torture, a horrific legal standard that applied to all enslaved people in Athens, not just the pornai. They were trapped in a system of fabricated debt and constant violence. When they finally died, their bodies were often discarded like trash, denied a proper burial, denied even the dignity of being remembered. In a city that gave the world the very concepts of logic, beauty, and civic freedom, the lives of these women stand as a horrifying contradiction. Their pain was turned into jokes in comedies, and their abuse was depicted casually on pottery. Their existence was the dark secret everyone knew, the brutal reality that powered the gleaming facade of the Golden Age. The marble of the Parthenon still stands today as a symbol of human achievement, but it stands on a foundation we rarely acknowledge, a foundation of blood, tears, and the bodies of forgotten women. Their names are lost, their voices were silenced, but their story is a devastating reminder that history is often written by the victors and the true cost of greatness is often paid by those who are never mentioned at all. If you believe these forgotten stories are crucial to understanding our shared past, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. By spreading this knowledge, we can ensure that these voices, silenced for millennia, are finally heard. Thank you for watching.